Chapter 5 The Farm. Mr. Sharif turned and shouted, "Come here, Rambler!" A moment later, a pickup truck automatically rolled out from the garage. The truck pulled up to the man and the robot. Its doors opened wide, and they both climbed in. Rambler had a steering wheel, but Mr. Sharif sat back and let the truck drive itself. They followed the driveway behind the house, across the backyard, past trees and hedges, and suddenly they were surrounded by farm buildings. The buildings were different sizes and shapes, all white walls with gray roofs, and they were so tightly packed together that you could hardly tell where one building ended and the next one began. Some were spattered with mud, others had holes and loose boards. The entire place smelled like grass and manure. Mr. Sharif pointed out each building to Roz. There was the enormous dairy barn, the milking parlor, the workshop, the machine shed. Smaller sheds were scattered all around. Rambler drove out of the building and down the back side of the hill into a wide sweep of farmland. A fence lined this part of the driveway, and behind the fence was a sprawling, rolling pasture, lush with tall grass and a few leafy trees, where a herd of cows were grazing. The cows swished their tails and chewed their cud and followed the truck with their eyes. One of them let out a long moo. "This is a dairy farm," said Mr. Sharif, "so these cows are the queens around here. Your whole world now revolves around them. Understand?" "I understand," said Roz, as she stared at a young calf who was staring right back at her. They rolled past the herds of cows, past clumps of wildflowers, past a quiet pond, past birds and field mice and bumblebees. The driveway cut through a row of trees on its way out to the crop fields, which were flat and squared and covered with bright green sprouts. Hilltop Farm was bursting with life, but it had seen better days. Patches of weed and bare dirt were spreading across the fields. Broken down farm machines and piles of junk were strewn across the grounds. Thick tangles of brush were creeping in from the edges of the property. They drove all the way out to the farthest fields, to a little roundabout at the very end of the driveway. Rambler shut off its engine, and the man and the robot sat and looked at the countryside. Far off, where the land met the sky, a train quietly slid along its tracks and disappeared to the north. Then all was still. "This farm needs help," said Mr. Sharif at last. "It's been in my family for generations, and I don't want to lose it. But I can't do farm work anymore, not with this bad leg. That's why you're here. They say Roz and robots can learn to do almost every kind of job, and you'll have to do almost every kind of job on this farm." "I understand," said Roz. "We've had auto machines for ages," Mr. Sharif went on, "but we didn't need a robot until my wife died." Those last words hung in the air for a while. The silence was finally broken by a low rumble of thunder. A storm was approaching. Tornado season was still months away, but in farm country, any storm could become dangerous. "Let's go home," said Mr. Sharif. Rambler started its engine and drove back up the long driveway. By the time they reached the farm buildings, a steady rain was falling, and the cows were in the barn. "This is for you," said Mr. Sharif, as he handed Roz her own computer. "That controls the farm equipment, and it's got all the information you'll need to work here. Do you know how to use a computer?" "Yes, I know how to use a computer." Roz had never used a computer before, but she instinctively knew what to do. Clearly, the robot was designed to work with technology. "Study up tonight and start farming tomorrow," said Mr. Sharif. "You can stay in the machine shed with the other machines." "Perhaps I should stay in the barn with the cows," said Roz. "My whole world revolves around them." The man smirked and he said, "I like the way you think, Roz." Chapter 6 is titled The Monster. The cows were munching hay in their stalls when the big barn door slid open and a mechanical monster stomped in from the rain. The creature marched down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing through the cavernous space, until she found an empty corner. And there she stood in the shadows as a storm began to rage outside. Everybody listened as the rain poured in and the wind howled and the thunder cracked. By midnight, the storm had blown over, and there was only a gentle sprinkling on the roof. But the herd couldn't rest with that monster lurking in the corner. The cows began quietly mooing to each other. "What is this monster doing? She hasn't moved in hours. I bet she's waiting to eat us in our sleep." The cows gasped at this horrible thought, and then an old cow named Annabelle tried to calm down the herd. Relax, everyone, she said. There were monsters like this at my last farm, and they never ate any cows. Come to think of it, they never ate anything at all. If this monster has never eaten anything at all, she must be awfully hungry by now, said a cow named Tess. I saw the farmer driving the monster around in this truck, said a calf named Lily. I don't think he would have done that if she were dangerous. Nobody knew quite what to think of the strange creature in their midst. I think the monster is harmless. I think the monster is unnatural. I think the monster is moving. The herd fell silent as the monster marched out from the shadows and into the middle of the barn. And then the monster did the impossible. She did the unthinkable. She spoke to the cows in the language of the animals. I am not a monster. I am a robot. My name is Roz. Chapter 7 is The Robot's Story. None of the cows could believe that this monster, this robot, this machine, had just spoken to them in the animal language. They stared at her, nervously shifting in their stalls, wondering what she would do next. What Roz did next was simple. She told the truth. She stood in the middle of the barn and shared her story with the herd. I spent my first year of life on a remote wild island, Roz began. I did not know how I got there. I only knew that I wanted to survive. So I studied the island animals to see how they survived, and a surprising thing happened. Their sounds and movements started making sense to me. I was learning the language of the animals. Even when I could speak to them, the animals wanted nothing to do with me. But that changed when I discovered an orphaned gosling. The poor little thing would have died on his own, so I cared for him and adopted him as my son. His name is Brightbill. A murmur spread through the herd. When the animals saw me caring for Brightbill, they finally accepted me. I was no longer alone. I had friends and a family and a home. Life was good. Here's a picture of Roz flashing back, thinking of Brightbill. Until the Rico robots arrived. They came in their sleek white airship to take me away, and when I resisted, they became violent. The animals defended me. They fought bravely, and they destroyed the Ricos. But I was badly damaged in the fighting. I needed repairs, and I could not get them on the island. So the animals loaded my broken body into the airship and took me far away from my home. Lily the calf poked her head through the railing and said, What about Brightbill? My son is smart and tough, and he has a good flock, said Roz. I think he will be okay without me. Where were you taken? Said Tess. I was taken back to the factory where I was made. The factory is run by a crew of robot workers called the Makers. When I arrived, they put me in a room filled with other broken robots. Some robots were completely ruined, and the Makers immediately sent them away. But those of us with working computer brains were given a test. Here's another image. Oops, wrong side, sorry. What kind of test? Said Lily. The Makers simply asked us questions. They asked us how we had become damaged. They asked us how we would respond to different emergencies. They asked us to identify certain sounds and smells and objects. Robots who answered every question correctly were repaired. All others were destroyed. In the wilderness, I camouflaged my body to survive. In the robot factory, I camouflaged my personality to survive. I pretended to be a perfectly normal robot. I did not say that I had adopted a goose, or that I could speak with animals, or that I had resisted the Ricos. I said what I had to say to pass the test, and it worked. Good for you, Roz, shouted Tess, and the other cows smiled. The Makers shut me off, and when I awoke, my body was fixed, and I was on this farm. Now, like all of you, I belong to Mr. Sharif. The cow stopped smiling. Everyone was quiet, and then old Annabelle spoke up. I was taken from my friends and family too, she said. They're back on the farm where I was born. I still think about them every day. It is difficult to be apart from our loved ones, said the robot. You know, Roz, things could be worse, said Tess. At least on this farm, you're still surrounded by nature. Yes, things could be worse. The robot's eyes brightened a little. But I am not safe here. If any human ever learns who I really am, they will have me destroyed. And that is why, when the time is right, I will try to escape. And chapter 8 is titled The Computer.